Okay, so we're going to do the client deep dive now. I know that we're kind of going off schedule, but it's 11:44 and it took a little bit longer than I expected to get going. So let me just close up this stuff really quick. Yeah, go away. Bye, 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 bye. Okay, you don't have to have Thorium running right now if you don't want to, but you can if you do. I am live on the live stream. So, Thorium split into two separate folders that separate the client and the server from each other. And yeah, let's just dive into this. So we've got this client folder right here, and it has a couple of things. For those of you that know, the client is bootstrapped with Create React App, except I'm a stinker and I did it with Create React App 2, which is an alpha because I live on the edge. Well, it works great. If you're new to JavaScript and node type development, we have a package.json file that gives a little bit of metadata about this, and then you remember those dependencies I told you about that it installs. This is where it saves all of those dependencies, okay? So if you ever add a dependency to Thorium for the front end specifically, make sure you save it to this package.json. I'm trying to keep the dependencies separate from the client and the server. I use NPM. I think NPM works well enough, and it's a little bit more ubiquitous than Yarn. Because if you have Node, you have NPM. That's not to say Yarn isn't great, but that's just the way I feel. The way that Create React App works is you have a public folder that's just for static assets. So if I open up this folder, you'll see here I've got some assets that's just empty. I've got my index.html file. I've got this sciences sound effect, which is that sound that plays. That's just bundled. I've got some CSS files for my fonts. I have some SVG files here for those and for the card icons. So any card has to have an icon, which either you can design yourself if you really feel like it, or you can say, hey, Alex, can you design an icon for me? And I'll be like, sure, because I like that kind of thing. I have some JavaScript. And I have some image pictures here. Thank you, Endless Skies, and view screen pictures and whatnot. So there's just a couple of things that I store in here. For stuff that's specific to cards, I like to keep the images directly with the card. And so I use the bundler. For those of you that know what that is, it basically lets me take an image and import it into my code file and then just use it. Thank you, Webpack. All of the fun stuff is in the source folder. So we've got a couple of files here. The index.js file is the main file, and you see this is pretty lightweight. Let me do just a really quick explanation of React for those that don't know. React is a JavaScript framework for creating user interfaces. It uses a paradigm where you have a function, and if you feed it some data, we'll call that data state, shove it into that function, it's going to pop out your UI. In this case, it's creating HTML and CSS, well, and the images and the JavaScript, the logic for it. But that's all that it is. You have your function, you take your state, you throw it at the function, and it spits out the data. Okay? And that's what this app thing is right here. That's a function. And I'm taking that function and shoving it onto my web page at this root element in JavaScript. If you don't get what this is, that's okay. I apologize. This is a little bit higher level. So if you don't understand these things, dive into JavaScript, learn JavaScript so you can understand it eventually. Do you want to? If anybody wants to get started, sorry, Matt, do you want to keep watching this? Because Crystal can, yeah, Crystal, you got this. Yeah, and if you need an example page for the alert condition, you can just pull up the alert condition on Thorium. And if you need help with that, let me know. Okay? Anybody that wants to just do a quick boot camp with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, if you have no experience with that, come with Crystal. She'll use the lab computers and CodePen, and or you have a computer. Yeah, yeah. So go with Crystal and enjoy. Yep. Okay. Yeah, and apologies if this is confusing. Again, if you have any questions, raise your hand, and I'll help you out, okay? Okay, while you guys are running off, I'm going to jump back into this. This is the function. This is the function that gets Thorium started and up and running. And you might notice that it looks a bit like HTML code. It has the angle brackets with slashes, and it has the attributes here. In React, we call those props. It's very similar to HTML in that respect. It's called JSX. It makes it just a little bit easier to write readable React code. If you want to understand what's going on behind the scenes with JSX, watch Kent C. Dodd's React video, because he goes into that and explains how React works. But each of these things here, with the uppercase letter, these are called components, and they are essentially functions. And these components are functions within functions, and it's basically this endless function within function, turtles all the way down kind of shindig. But each of these functions does something for Thorium. So in this case, I have the Apollo provider. Apollo is the GraphQL library that I use to get data from the server. And I have to have that at the top of my app so that I can get that data from anywhere within Thorium. Then here, I have my INTL provider. That gives me the internationalization, the localization, the translations. Then I have an error boundary. This is the thing that whenever there's an error that happens further down the line in one of the other functions, it's the thing that pops up and says, there's been an error in Thorium. And that makes sure that we have a good user experience when those kind of things happen. And then I have an Easter egg. I'm not going to tell you what it does. You can find out for yourself. And then I have routes. What? Yeah, that's so I'll actually get a little real here for a second. It's actually a tribute to my dad. He's passed away, if you didn't know, and the Easter egg does a little poem that he liked that also is very pertinent to Thorium. Thorium uses React Router for the routing, which is just whenever the URL changes, show this. So if I were to pull up Thorium, demonstrate this. Oh, I got a little message here. I need to make sure that I'm... Tyler, make sure you're running as administrator when you're using Visual Studio Code. It's probably what the problem is. So you'll notice that as I navigate around Thorium, it's going to change the URL up here, and it's going to change what components are showing, okay? And I try and split the components into two separate categories. You have the crew-facing components. Those are in the actual components folder here. And then you have the configuration components that are in the containers, okay? So basically anything before a flight starts is in the containers folder. Anything that is after a flight starts is in the components folder. Weird nomenclature, naming stuff is hard, I'm sorry. But I pull in all of that stuff up here, and I use the routes to match these paths, and then it goes from there. So I think a card would be the most interesting thing to start with. Let's go into components, and you'll see that there are several folders here for several different things. The README is mostly up to date, kind of up to date. Yeah, a little bit up to date, that explains what each of these folders is for. So if we want to edit cards, we'll see the views folder is the one that we want. So we open that up and boom, there it is. Those are all of the cards, okay? One thing that's really important to remember is that all of these cards have to be consumed at some level of the Thorium, right? You can't just stick a folder in there and then it magically appears in Thorium. You have to specifically say, I want this folder, all of the code in this folder to be used. And we have an index.js file here at the bottom. And this is the case in a lot of these folders where there's just a lot of stuff. I just concatenate it all, bring it all together in the index file. So here I'm importing all of these using the or what is it, CommonJS import statement. ES6, yeah, ES6 import statement. And then down here, I bring it all together into an object, a keyed object, again using ES6 because ES6 is awesome. And I export that down here. There it is, I export it. Same thing with the cores. So up here I'm importing all of the views, all of the cards, and then the cores are also in this views folder right next to the components that relate to that. So the engine core is going to be right next to the engine control so that you don't have to go digging around finding it somewhere else. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but that's mostly how it is. And I have all of the cores here as well that I export from there. Okay. So far so good. Any questions? Yes. So I'm actually going to work on Thorium as part of this workshop. You're going to see me in action as I demonstrate this. I'm actually going to start working on a new card right now for the Railgun, which is something that the Farpoint Space Center requested. Yeah, you're right, but you don't tell me what to do. You keep this master list and you're just waiting to, here you go, Alex, here's a bunch of stuff to work on. So you send me what you want and I'll get it working on. Yeah. Yeah, James, work on it yourself. Gosh. So I try and make this as simple as possible for me because, you know, my brain can only handle so much. So I have a template right here. Oh, crap. I won't be able to work on this like I was hoping I'd be able to because I don't have the back-end stuff taken care of. But that's fine. We can still play with it really quick. I have this template here, which has the core, the index file, and then the actual card component itself, and then a style file for our CSS. My folder path is client, source, components, views, template. And I'm going to duplicate this. Yeah, I should probably change it so it's cards instead of views. That would be more nomenclature-esque, but okay. So I just duplicated this template folder into the Railgun up here. Awesome, we're good to go. And now I can come down here into my index.js, and I like to keep them in order just because, like, I'm kind of vain and I like to see what stuff I worked on in what order. So I just put the card here. In fact, let me do this. Cores. Boom. Now I know those are cores. I'm going to import Railgun from /Railgun. This is just a relative link to that Railgun/index.js file. And then I'll do the same thing for the core. Down here. Import Railgun core from Railgun/core. And notice JavaScript is awesome. You don't have to include the .js. I know the guy that invented Node doesn't like that. He recently talked about how he thinks that's dumb. I agree with him, but it's still convenient. And then I'm just going to put these at the end of my cores. Yeah, battle core. Wait for that one. That'll be fun. You'll like that. That'll be sometime next week. I'll push that out. And a nice thing is, anytime you make a change, it's automatically going to refresh. Ah, check it out. There's a big bug. That's because the way that the template is, it gives you all of the scaffolding, but you have to change the stuff. You can't just use the template by itself, which is probably good because we don't want to just have people duplicating the template and then forgetting to change it. So the problem is right here in my GraphQL. Again, as a quick primer of GraphQL, it's a way of sending messages to my server, and then the server sends messages back based on the messages that I sent. Okay? It's an API. There are 3 operations that I can perform. One of them is a query, which says, I want this data. And then I tell it in the structure that I want, this is the data that I want. And then it sends back that data. I can say a mutation, which is where I give it a command to perform with all of the arguments, all of the stuff that it needs to do as part of that command. And then GraphQL does support sending back responses with that, but with Thorium, I opted not to do that. In retrospect, I think that was a bad plan. I think it would be better if I did have it send back a response, but right now it just sends back nothing. It doesn't even, it throws an error if there was an error performing it, but that's about it. The reason why is because all of the updates to the stations, all of the updates that are performed by the mutations happen with the third operation, which is a subscription, which is where I say, hey server, I want to get this data whenever it changes. Okay? So right here I have a query that I'm performing and a subscription. I assume with the template that you're going to be doing a query and a subscription, because otherwise what good is this station for you? I mean, maybe it's just something that does something locally. But for the most part, you're going to be sending data to the server. And the query is going to get the initial data when the card first loads. It's going to say, hey, give me this data. And then it's also going to get any of the additional data with this subscription. You'll notice I'm using Apollo. I have the GQL tag, which transforms this string text into a GraphQL AST. If you've never used Apollo, this is just standard operating procedure for GraphQL queries. And the convenient thing is I wrap it all in a template string, which gives me the ability to put it on multiple lines. It also gives me the ability to put in template tags. And in this case, the data that I want for my query is almost always, like 100% of the time, going to be the same data that I want for my subscription. Because any data that I get for my query, I want to get the updates to that data when it changes. As a note, if you need to subscribe to multiple things, if you have a card that needs data from the simulator and from a system like the railgun and from another system, like for example, the way that the railgun is going to work is it's going to integrate with the sensors. So in order for that to work, I have to get data from both the railgun and from the sensors. So I could build my queries around that sensors data. Let's do that really quick. I actually have the data, most of the data that I need already in the battle core because it is related to this. So let me grab this right here. And nope, that's not it. I'm getting mixed up here. So just pardon me while I get all this taken care of. I'm just going to replace that there. And well, no, this will take a little bit too long. We're just going to skip the GraphQL stuff. Sorry. Just going to do that. And we're not going to worry about that. Okay. The way that I've set up the template is it grabs all of the data in this index.js file, and then it sends that data to the card. And then the card doesn't have to worry about any data fetching whatsoever. All that it worries about is taking the data that you've collected and displaying it. So that gives us a little bit of separation of concerns. You don't have to worry about data fetching in the card. Okay? And I'm already importing from this template.js file, so let's go to town. And the core, it has the same problem, so let me get rid of this as well. Oops. And we'll do that. And we'll do this. And now we should have a card that says hello world, and we also have a core that says hello world right here. That's how that works. And oh, I've got to comment out all of this too because it's whining. Boom, there we go. Okay. There are two ways that you can consume these cards. If you're in development, you can go to debug and find the card. We're looking for the railgun. And there it is. And this will just show you a card. It's not connected to any simulator. So there's a lot of things that you can't do with it. It's just a really limited way of just showing what you have there. It won't work for some cards, though, depending on the data that you need. And then I also have the same thing. Nope, that was wrong. But for the core, I have my debug core, and I can come in here and throw it into just one of these dynamic cores. And there it is. Boom. So that's how you create these views. Then you use React to compose them. Okay, so let's do that really quick. I'm just going to copy and paste from a couple of places and maybe throw an image on there, and we'll go from there. Before I dive into that, let me just quickly go over some of these other things, these other pieces. Admin has hardly anything in it, it's just the issue tracker. You probably shouldn't mess with that because it works. If you really feel like messing with it, let me know so that you don't mess up the system that I have for sending these issues to GitHub. On the client, this is all of the stuff that that runs and that displays the card when you go to /client. It has a sound player, it has the subscriptions to the simulator and to the client, so if you change the client station or the client simulator, it'll update automatically. It also has the credit stuff. So if you ever do anything awesome with Thorium, like anything at all, please put your name in the credits, because I think that everybody should get credit for helping, for doing awesome stuff. And yeah, don't feel shy about the credits in the README or the credits in the in this, because if you do even the littlest thing, like Gunrobe, I will put you in there anyway, because I think you deserve credit. So, yeah. Core is for the core layout. So this isn't where you put the cores for your components. This is just for the layouts themselves. So if you want to make a new layout that's configured in a different way or whatever, you can totally do that. The layouts live here. The menu bar at the top of the core up here is in the menu bar folder. And then I have these different categories for each of the core components that lets you, this is actually one of my favorite features, you can use F keys, to display any of the core components at any time. Which means it doesn't matter what layout you're on, you can display whatever. So those are configured in this categories folder, and then I got just this hotkey thing that checks for the keys that you type in and goes to town on that. Generic just gives you a couple of generic things. One handy thing is this generic core, which gives you these 3 components that are callbacks to old Space Center core style. So you got the input field, which is a yellow field that you can click on to type in, the output field, which is blue, but it turns red if there's some alert going on, and then the typing field, which is a gray field that you can just type in. So you can see those here. These yellow ones are input fields, blue one is an output field, and then typing field, I don't know, somewhere. I suppose there's one on the sensors core. So this is a typing field that you can type in. So just some generic stuff that you can use, but it's really configurable. React is awesome, man. These right here are the layouts. So if I pull up, I suppose I need to get a client actually up. And I suppose I need to actually not be on the, no, this is for a flight, we're good. Station. So this right here is the layout glass. And it's the animated frame that came from Nathan King. Thank you, Nathan. But I can switch that using the ship core right here. So there's the Odyssey layout. Thank you, James, for letting me appropriate this. Not getting mad at me. The layout corners, which is the original. And I really like this one, actually. I think it's really slick. But I'm also really partial to the layout line, which I just barely came up with, which I think looks hot. That's so cool. And layout Phoenix. Again, thank you, James, for letting me appropriate this. There's my layout first, though, since I programmed them. And then layout Junior, which is literally for the junior controls. You can't change cards on layout Junior, so only use this if you plan on showing one card at a time. But I suppose you could expand this and make it more featureful if you really wanted to. Totally possible. Anyway, so those are the layouts. Layouts are pretty straightforward. I think the Junior would be the easiest. Well, no, let me do the line layout. It just has this index thing that takes in all these props about the simulator, the station, which cards you're on, a function that you can use to change the cards, the client information, and information about the flight. And then you just compose those together to create the layout. There's a render cards function, which you import from render cards here, card renderer, and it just takes the list of cards from the station and which card you're on and shows it. So that makes that part really easy. I wrap it in a transition group so that you have the fancy transitions when you switch between cards. Yep, so that's all that is. And then widgets, which are these little things down here that give you extra functionality on every card. Some cards have been configured as widgets, so you can use them as a card or as a widget. I suppose you could configure whatever card you want as a widget if you really wanted to. Yeah, Matt? Actually, the widget is just itself. There is no card for the message composer. There could be. Nothing wrong with that, certainly. Officer's log is one, though, that is both a card and a widget. And those are separately configured in the views/index.js. Oh, gotta get to views. Down here. The reason widgets are a little bit more complicated to configure is because they require an icon. I have it type in the actual name here, and then the color of the icon down here. So that is actually static. You can't change that. Nobody's asking you to make it so that you can change the color and the icon of a widget. And these icons, just to be clear, are font awesome. If you've ever used font awesome, it's awesome font for icons. Just to be clear, also I use 4.7. I haven't upgraded to 5 yet, which is fine, I guess. So widgets are separate. But you want to make sure that you have widgets. I mean, if you don't include widgets, you need to make sure that there are ways to do the things that widgets do. Like this right here is a widget that's not configured. It's always there. It's the training widget so that I can access the training mode for the individual cards. And then I have my logout widget as well. So you have to provide some kind of ability to do those things if it's not included in the card, in the layout. But that's basically it. I've got a card switcher, which is this thing up here at the top. I've got my widgets. I've got my card frame, which is the actual, what it looks like. And then I have the cards themselves that are rendered in the middle. And then you use CSS to style it so it looks nice. Okay? That's layouts. Layouts are awesome. I would love to get like a ton of really sick looking layouts. I have a couple. Let's see about that. I'll show them to you later. You don't have time for this. Then I have my macros. Remember with the missions, you can only do predefined macros. These macros right here that you see, the names that they have are actually the names of the GraphQL mutations, which are the events that are happening. So mutations translate directly to events in most cases. So that is what's the word I'm looking for? That's the way you have to do it. You've got to name it that so that it knows which is which. But these macros are just the configuration. So if I come here to process data, it's just an input that I type in, and it gives me the args for the macro, gives me a function I can use to update the args, and it's just a key value system. I could probably make that nicer in other ways, but I change that if you need to. So in this case, anytime I type in this field and then leave the field with the onBlur event, it's going to update the data arg to be the value of the field. We have more complicated ones like the setArmyContacts, which actually uses a React component and keeps state. And I think it also, no, it's still just updating based on the args. But you can configure these and make these however you want, but this is the configuration. This is how these macros are configured. Once I get done talking about the macros, we're done with the views, we got that, so we'll break for lunch at that point, and then we can dive into something else. So that's macros. Any questions about any? Good question. I'm using ReactStrap, which is a React components for Bootstrap 4. Although, Let me see if I can find this. I got an email this morning from Nathan King that is, this is just super sick looking. I don't know if people will like it, but check this out. Bloop. This is a React sci-fi cyberpunk GUI framework, which looks super cool and has these primitive components that you can use for all kinds of things. Bloop. And bloop. And no, that's not it. This, nope, that's its own thing. Where was it? There was one that I was like, oh, that looks really sick. I'd love to throw that in there. Yeah. Anyway, so I might throw that into Thorium too, maybe just for a specific layout, but I think that you'd have to edit the components in the cards themselves. So that does give us that does limit us a little bit. You have to use React Strap, which means you have to override Bootstrap in order to change the way that the components look, and you have to deal with the HTML that React Strap gives you. One thing that I might do is make a Thorium components library, like an NPM module, that imports from React Strap and then overrides those. And then we just replace all of the references to React Strap to these new components, and then you can modify them however you want with whatever props you want. So that'd be sick. This is something that I could probably do nicer, but I don't right now, so deal with it. We can refactor it later. These are literally just duplicates of the macros, except they're in a printer-friendly format. So that mission is really big. I can export the mission script right here, and what that does is it takes all of my timeline actions, these macros, and displays what's happening at that point in the mission so that I can print off that mission script just like the old days. So that's what the macros print is, just printable. Yeah, that's it. Any questions? Okay, let's get some pizza, and then we will come back and we can dig into stuff or talk about stuff more or whatever. And Tyler, I'll help you. I am so sorry. It's going to be messy. Yeah. Yes. What? Can I see? Oh, yeah. We'll kick this off again at 1:45. It will take half an hour. Yep. Thanks for reminding me to kick off.